Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us. In some sense, this could be the second of our basement tapes with Dr. Brooke Blades. This is actually his second lecture for us. The first one we did back about 2 weeks ago that looked at Operation Varsity and the end of March, early April in Europe. This lecture looks specifically at the operations in late April and early May leading to German surrender. For those who may have missed his first talk, it is available on YouTube. And if you need to, I can provide you the link later on. I'd ask you to please hold your questions until the end of Dr. Brooks' talk, but I should say Dr. Blades' talk, not Dr. Brooks, but Dr. Blades' talk. So at this time, Brooks, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mike, and welcome back to any of those who participated in the first session and have re-upped for this one. At the end of it, we had talked about the crossing of the Rhine at various locations, including the combined British infantry, American infantry, British and American airborne operation across the Rhine called Operation Varsity. The ground forces had a different name, but the airborne portion was Varsity. And a little bit about what had gone on in that part of Germany after the crossing. But we've left these guys sort of out there, almost finished, but not quite. So we thought we'd pick it up and carry it to the end and tell some of the stories, some of the anecdotes that occurred during the final month of the war, and some little hint of the aftermath. And with that, Mike, if you could take it to the next slide. Okay, we used this map before, but now we'll talk about the sort of right-hand portion of it, the portion on the opposite side of the Rhine, the east side of the Rhine. Basically what happens is the Allied troops are advancing on a front from the North Sea, from Holland, and down to the Swiss border. And of course, the Eastern Allies, the Russian forces, Red Army, are pushing in from Poland and Ukraine. From north to south, the British forces under General Montgomery would drive across the North German plain, ultimately to Hamburg. Their goal was multifold, but primarily to secure as much territory as they could up to and beyond the Elbe River, thereby preventing a Russian advance into Denmark, because they did not want the Russians to have control of the peninsula and also to have frontage on the North Sea. And beyond that, in some effort to reduce the V weapons launch sites that were wreaking havoc in parts of England. The V2 rocket sites were further east still, at Panamunda and places like that, but there were other sites that they could overrun. The Canadian and Polish forces with General Montgomery were securing territory in northern Holland at that point, up to the North Sea. When you talk about the American forces, which constitute the bulk of the troops in Western Europe at that point, the U.S. 9th Army that had recently been released from the control of General Montgomery would circle around the northern side of the Ruhr Industrial District as the First Army would circle up from the south, and they would meet at a point on the 1st or 2nd of April. At that point, the control of the 9th Army returned to General Bradley. And although the Ruhr was not fully subjugated till about the 3rd week in April, they did encircle and prevent the escape of over 300,000 German troops at that point. Other elements of both armies would continue to advance eastward with divisions in the Ninth Army reaching Magdeburg on the Elbe by the 11th of April. And they were eager and expecting to continue on to Berlin, but they found that would not be the case, and we'll talk about that in a bit. The First Army moved further south a little bit to a line. If you look at the line from Magdeburg down past the Harz Mountains, you'll see another little river coming down. It's called the Mulde, and that became the stop line for the American armies, the Elbe down to the Mulde and the Mulde further south. One of the concerns that Bradley was talking about with Eisenhower was, what would we do, what will we do to prevent a catastrophic conflict between advancing Russian forces and Allied forces in the West? Not necessarily because the Russians would intend to attack, but they were just concerned that there might be an accidental conflict. And what they decided to do was pick out a river line as being an obvious place where you could stop. In addition, there's kind of a tension continuing in the Allied ranks. Churchill and the British Joint Chiefs of Staff had expected and urged an advance on Berlin. This had been something that had been debated about since the fall of the previous year, and we talked about that a little bit last time. And Eisenhower had changed his views and decided to drive through on a line passing through Leipzig, which is a little further south down the Mulde. He resisted the pressure that was being exerted on him with the statement that his concerns were military and not political at this point. In addition, he had consulted Bradley and said, how many casualties would you estimate it would cost us to continue the 70 miles from Magdeburg on to Berlin? And Bradley estimated about 100,000. And they both felt this would be unreasonable given that the U.S. would not remain in possession of all that territory, the U.S. and the British, but instead would have to fall back to the west, not only to the Elbe, but further back to a line that had been agreed upon at previous meetings, and I think finally formalized between the three powers, Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill, at the Yalta Conference. So they knew they already advanced past the original area where their zone of control would lie, and they had been carved out and defined at Yalta. So, and it turns out that Bradley's estimate was probably pretty close to the mark, because by most accounts, when the Soviets and the Red Army did subjugate Berlin, it cost them something in the neighborhood of 78,000 casualties, and actually 3 or 4 times that number if you talk about all 3 of their advancing army fronts at that point. We also have Patton's Third Army advancing up through Frankfurt. They circle, part of it, one corps circles up to Kassel, which is further east of the Ruhr. But the bulk of it continues eastward and then in turn circles down towards the Czech-Austrian border by the end of April and into early May. And there's a great anecdote about the pressure that the Third Army continued to exert about going into Czechoslovakia. They ultimately advanced as far as Pilsen, which is just across the border, and could have moved on Prague, but they were, in no uncertain terms, it was indicated that the Red Army did not want them to move that far. And finally, in response to this pressure, Bradley asked Patton why, as he put it, why does everyone in the Third Army want to invade Czechoslovakia? And Patton's response was somewhat legendary. He indicated that all the countries they had been passing through, Germany, Austria, officially were countries where the men were not allowed to fraternize with civilians, and particularly the young women. But the Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia was an allied country. He said, so our battle cry is on to Czechoslovakia and fraternization. He said, how can you stop an army with a cry like that? So at the end of the war, they did actually probe into the Czech Republic a little bit. And then finally, the southern end of that line, you have the 6th Army Group. Bradley's collection of 3 armies is the 12th Army Group. But you have the 6th Army Group that had landed, you'll see at the bottom of the map, up the Rhone Valley in August of 1944 under Jacob Devers. And that consisted of 2 armies, the US 7th Army and the French 1st Army. And they would skirt along the border of neutral Switzerland and then probe into the Austrian Tyrol. And they capture cities that are now fairly well known, such as Salzburg for its classical music, Sound of Music, the film, and the winter sports towns such as Kitzbühel, which are famous for alpine skiing. At any rate. Okay, Mike, next slide, please. One of the discoveries that the Third Army made in its zone was twofold. One had to do with an art and gold bullion repository in the town of Merkers. If you are familiar with the book, The Monuments Men, that talks about this period, there are varying tales about what happens, but one of the stories recounted in Bradley's account is that some MPs found women on the street after the curfew time. And it was explained to the MPs that they were actually out looking for a midwife because they had to help a woman deliver a baby. The MPs decided to help them. And as they walked past a bolted door, a woman said fairly casually, that's where they keep the gold bullion. So they investigated this and discovered a salt mine that extended down over 2,000 feet, in which there were depositories of Reichsgold, currency, and looted artworks. And this is a picture taken on the 12th of April. And you see Eisenhower in the foreground looking through the art. And you can tell how cold it is in the storage area because they're all bundled up. And behind him is Patton, and then to his left is Omar Bradley. And they're sort of leafing through the framed paintings. Mike, go ahead and do the next one. But there was another reason why Patton wanted them to come down. In early April, the 4th Armored Division went into the town of Ohrdruf, and near there they discovered a camp. It was the first concentration camp that the Western Allies had encountered. Stories have been circulating really throughout the war about camps in Germany and Europe, and some had reached the ears of Jewish authorities in the country who actually approached President Roosevelt about certain camps and asked them to bomb the railheads because they thought that if they did that, the Germans could get fewer people in to be murdered. But common knowledge of this in the West was very limited. Even after the summer of 1944, when the Red forces in Poland, Red Army forces, encountered Treblinka. And it was so devastating that people found it absolutely incomprehensible. There was even a BBC reporter with the group who reported back to London. But the Western governments were disinclined to believe the accounts, in part because they were so horrible in their details. And they thought that it was possible that the Soviet forces had cooked the whole thing up. That had happened, by the way. I digress, but it had happened at Katyn near Smolensk, where the Red Army had murdered several hundred, I think over 1,000 Polish officers who had surrendered in 1939, 1940, and then later blamed it on the Germans. And even after the Germans overran it and claimed that the Red Army had done it, the Red Army continued to deny that they had and blamed it on the Germans. So there was precedent for this, but by the time the Allies themselves, Western Allies, began to get into the heart of Germany, central Germany, Thuringia, they began to find these camps for themselves. The British found Belsen, Bergen-Belsen in their sector. Americans found Ohrdruf, and then others in fairly rapid succession. This particular scene shows Eisenhower being led around the camp and being shown a pit where the bodies of people from the camp were burned or buried. And one of the accounts indicates that Eisenhower was very suspicious of this man because he seemed, even though he professed to be an inmate, he seemed too well fed. And in fact, the next day, his body was found. He had been murdered by some of the other camp inmates because he, in fact, was a guard who had dressed up in their costume. After this event, I mean, you can imagine the experience of, and all three individuals, Eisenhower, Bradley, and Patton, left rather dramatic accounts of what they experienced there. They really are, even today, make difficult reading, I think. On that evening, Bradley and Eisenhower stayed with Patton at his headquarters. His headquarters was actually a mobile trailer or caravan parked next to a former German barracks. And they had dinner in the barracks, and both Bradley and Eisenhower were lodged there. And that the account is mentioned, they had a meal together and talked well into the night. Eisenhower was explaining the fact that the Americans were in fact not going to go to Berlin. They were going to leave it to the Germans, to the Russians, to occupy. What is not commonly known is that they weren't alone. There were 3 Red Cross female workers with them. Nothing untoward. Apparently they just wanted some female companionship for the meal to lighten the conversation. But later, it was when it was revealed that this was the same night that Patton went back to his trailer, turned on the radio for a time check because his watch had stopped, and learned that FDR had died. He then went back into the barracks, went to Bradley's room, informed him, and then Bradley and Patton together went to tell Eisenhower about the death of the president. The next day, when it was released to the press, they wanted to know how Eisenhower discovered it. Patton says to Chet Hansen, who recorded all this in his diary, he said, probably be better to leave out the fact that we'd had dinner with three Red Cross workers. So that's the only place I've encountered that story, but it is in Chet Hansen's diary. Okay, Mike, next shot. Ohrdruf was not the only camp by any means. Another one to the north in Thuringia has various names. It's near the town of Nordhausen, so it's known as Nordhausen. But its formal name was Mittelbau Dora, and it's frequently known by the abbreviated name of Dora. And you encounter references to this camp somewhat frequently. I was in southwest France a couple of years ago, and I went to a small town that had been beset by German Gestapo and SS troops in the spring of 1944, just before the Normandy invasion. And certain individuals were murdered, certain were deported to camps, and the head of the local police was sent to Dora, where he died. And this is an arrangement of some of the inmates that were found just lying dead on the streets and in barracks at Dora. They found upwards of 1,200 corpses, but most of the people had been moved away prior to the onset of the arrival of the Allies. This particular one was found up by the 104th Division. There are many photographs of what is broadly termed the Holocaust in the National Archives, and many of them make for very difficult viewing. And some of them have been featured in documentaries and in publications. I didn't put many in the book because I think the ones that are there are sufficient to make the point. But the complex was a little unusual. Next slide, Mike, please. In that its purpose was to prepare parts and components for the V-2 rocket. And one of the people at Dora evidently had some photos on him, one of the German people there, because these photos are the same date as those from Dora, and I think April 13th, I think. And they were taken from this individual. It's an impressive image of a V-2 rocket standing up on its pad. Why they were there, I don't know. But nonetheless, that's what Dora was about. And its first prisoners were transported from Buchenwald, and I would imagine all of you have heard about Buchenwald. Eisenhower, when he was confronted by these images of bestial inhumanity, realized very quickly that he had to document what was happening because people, frankly, would find it hard to believe. And of course, today there are Holocaust deniers, which is a whole nother topic in itself, of why people do that and what their aims and goals are. But he brought in legislators from Britain and America. He brought in the press, and he had them make broadcast and give reports. And they're some of the most famous journalists in Europe reported from these camps. Martha Gellhorn, who had been, I think she had become or was about to become the third ex-wife of Ernest Hemingway, and was herself a rather remarkable journalist, wrote a story for Collier's magazine that was about Dachau. And Edward R. Murrow from CBS News gave a radio broadcast from the camp at Buchenwald, which was near this location. Mike, next slide, please. But the armies continued to move through, and they encountered resistance. It was scattered and varying. Some places it was more pronounced than others. Here are two German civilian women trying to eke out a meager existence in the overrun town of Zellerfeld in the Harz Mountains. The 1st Division was moving through here. And you begin to see the impact on a massive scale of as Germany collapsed, camps are being liberated. So whatever supplies the civilians were able to get had begun to collapse, and were depending upon whatever food they could find, whatever they might be able to get from the Allies, which would not have been very much. The last time we talked, I referred to members of the 513th Parachute Infantry that I had interviewed some years, about 10 years ago. And one of them, Irv Hennings from Minnesota, mentioned how surprised they were in Germany. And this is reflected, if you've seen Band of Brothers, this is reflected in the book in particular of the reactions of whatever images they had formed of Germany were surprisingly challenged in some instance by their interactions with civilians. Irv mentioned being in a cafe with his rifle slung over the chair when civilians began to come in, and at first they were a little trepidatious, but what they were really asking for if American soldiers would stay in their homes with them because they were afraid of people coming from these camps being liberated, the vengeance they might seek, thievery, whatever that might occur. And these are problems that lasted well after the war. I mean, this does not end by any means in May with the end of World War II. Mike, next shot, please. Another view of Zellerfeld. This is in mid-April, the third week in April, where some of the damage that villages were beginning to sustain, repeated over and over again. Of course, cities had been, in many cases, bombed into rubble by the strategic air forces. It had been so effective that they actually stopped the air campaign about the third week of April. They said there's really nothing much left to bomb. They thought it was just a waste of effort, and they began to focus on railheads or even troop concentrations that they would find in various parts of Germany and Austria. Next shot, please. Just a quick view of this arrival. This is kind of a famous shot. You see this appearing in a number of different settings. It's two soldiers from the 26th Infantry Division with Third Army are running through the central square of Kronach near Bayreuth, and apparently a fuel cart has been struck by artillery, and it's exploding in a rather dramatic fashion. Next shot, please, Mike. I alluded to the art that was being discovered, and it began to pop up at a variety of places. And if you haven't read Monuments Men, it's an interesting story. It's a compelling book. I think it needed more editing than it had because there's a certain repetition to it. But it's really an astounding story. The movie wasn't terribly successful, which is a shame because I think it deserved a better recognition than it got. In this case, soldiers have encountered a painting from a museum in Berlin by Edward Manet, a French painter, impressionist painter, called Winter Garden. And of course, the Nazis stole art from a variety of sources because the ultimate plan was to build a remarkable city in Austria to celebrate Hitler and the Nazi Party. And as a part of that, there was going to be a great and grand art museum, including artworks from all over Europe. This is just one example of one that turned up. But even more interesting, I think, is the next one. This shows two soldiers from the 101st Airborne at Zell am See. It's a lakeside resort in Austria, not too far from Salzburg, holding up a picture from the, and I would put this in quotation, the collection of Hermann Goering. Goering had something of a competition with Hitler about acquiring art. And ultimately, of course, Hitler got what he wanted, but so Goering kind of worked around the fringes, but each of them wanted a piece of artwork by Johannes Vermeer in Holland, one of the great Impressionist painters. And there aren't very many known. I think the actual number of documented Vermeers is about 40, 45. And so it was a prize for any art collector. So when this was shown to Goering, he having a lot of money and power, but not really any artistic knowledge, fell upon it and acquired it as Christ with the woman taken in adultery. And when there are, again, varying stories about this, Goering wasn't at home when they got there, but Mrs. Goering was, and she contended that the artwork was theirs, and she professed great concern that it was being taken. But apparently one of the maids went aside and told them of a painting rolled up Herr Goering had given to her, saying, if you ever get in difficulty, this will save your life, and it's worth a great deal of money. And they unrolled it, and it was this painting. Turns out it was a fake. It was painted by a Dutchman named Han van Meegeren. But it's actually not so much a copy as an absolute fake. As far as people know, Vermeer never painted this scene. And van Meegeren was revealed to be a rather remarkable forger. And he was put on trial after the war because he lived a fairly comfortable life in Holland while many others were starving and freezing. And he was initially put on trial as a collaborator. And his defense was he didn't sell this directly to Goering. Goering acquired it from somebody else. And furthermore, he actually put one over on them because he had painted it himself. Well, they didn't believe him at first. So he said, well, okay, give me canvas and paints and my cell, and I'll paint another one. And he did. So he went from being something of a national disgrace to a national hero, as somebody who put one over on one of the great Nazi criminals. At any rate, there are many dimensions to this story. Next shot, please. As the war was unfolding, the British continued, Montgomery continued to ask for assistance from American forces because he frankly didn't have many divisions left at that point. And they wanted to push on to and beyond the Elbe River along the Baltic coast. So they transferred, once they had achieved most of their aims, the Americans transferred the 18th Airborne Corps, which included the 82nd Airborne, up to British control, and they pushed into northeastern Germany. And they encountered a relatively small work camp, Vobelen, where most of the inmates had died from starvation and had been buried in mass graves. Well, one of the directives from Schaeff, from Eisenhower, would be when such camps with mass graves were encountered, that local men would be brought in, not U.S. Army troops who would direct them, to exhume the bodies, and that each body would be wrapped in a sheet, would be individually buried, and if in some way their religious affiliation could be determined, they were to be presided over by either a priest or rabbi or a minister. And that furthermore, all German citizens who were able to attend, walk through the cemetery, should be compelled to do so. And that there's a documentation of that at Vobelen, recorded in the very last week in April, first week in May. Okay, Mike. And of course, there were people who survived the camps. And in southern Germany, in Bavaria, Third Army encountered Ampfing camp, very close to the Austrian border, where, again, another very famous photo from World War II of some of the highly emaciated individuals who resided in the camp were found in conditions of, well, I think starvation and near nakedness. Okay, next one, please. On the 8th of May, well, back up a little bit. The actual document of surrender was signed on the early morning hours of the 7th of May in Reims, France, at a schoolhouse. And people began to immediately send messages around. And the formal date of VE Day is a little tricky because it occurs at midnight on the 8th, 9th, or actually a minute or two into the 9th. But I think most people consider the 8th of May as the formal day. The fighting ended, lines were frozen, and this parade occurred in the village of Imst. It's the 44th Infantry Division with 7th Army. You can see the Austrian Alps in the background, and the civilians are lined up to witness basically the end of the war. Next shot, please. There were losses to be recognized. There were, of course, massive losses in troops. There were even more massive in certain countries among civilians. It's estimated that in Russia and the Soviet Union, the number of civilian losses, I think around 21, 22 million, are 3 times that of the military losses, which were also, of course, substantial. But I think you can appreciate some of the impact by focusing on certain individuals. It humanizes it in a way that massive numbers sometimes fail to do so. During the Market Garden campaign, the 502nd Parachute Infantry was assisted by a member of the Irish Guards named Paddy McCrory, Squadron Sergeant Major McCrory, whose tank was slowed down and he couldn't keep up march speed. But he wanted to fight, so he offered, they asked him if he could assist them in knocking out some German guns, and he said he would. This arrangement lasted for a day or two, and they considered him our Mr. McCrory, and he continued to fight with the Irish Guards until late April, when he was killed in his tank on the North German plain. And he's buried in Becklingham War Cemetery. It's maintained by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. And I have the Joe French at the Commonwealth War Graves Commission to thank for the photo of his tombstone. Next slide, please. In February of 1945, a patrol from the 513th Parachute Infantry crossed from Luxembourg into Germany, near Affler, Germany, and became tied up in elements of the Siegfried Line. They were caught in crossfire, and their lieutenant was First Lieutenant John Leary, and he ordered the men to fall back while he covered them. And they were able to do so back across the river, but he did not join them. So at the end of the war, he was declared missing in action. And there it remained, and then formally, the procedure was, as I understand it, after a year, they would be formally declared killed, because that would enable the families to move forward and claim government insurance and things of that sort. In 1949, there were grave units spread across Europe, former battlefields, looking for missing individuals. And a German policeman approached them saying a farmer had contacted him to say he'd come across the grave of an American soldier. And they went out and investigated. And among other things, they found the dog tags, identification tags for Lieutenant Leary. He was exhumed, buried for a time, reburied for a time in Europe, and then was ultimately sent home to his wife and 2 young children on Staten Island, where he is ultimately buried now. It just symbolizes the loss in a way that I think simple statistics cannot do. And I've known a number of people, a man whose brother was killed in a B-17 over Schweinfurt. My own father-in-law lost a dear uncle in northern Italy. And I think these had impacts on people for the rest of their lives. I was contacted by somebody after the last talk to Operation Varsity to indicate he commented on the fact that I had said the 513th had landed to the north, and actually that enabled him to help the British land. And he said, but that came at a cost to their supporting Parachute Field Artillery Battalion. And the officers in one battery of that group landed on a landing zone that was uncleared, without infantry support. And all the officers in one battery were killed or wounded, including his father, who was killed. So these are losses that don't go away. They're opinions, and I have to thank, in this particular case, I have to thank John and Lillian Leary for the photograph of John's father. Next slide, please. There was retribution as one of the goals, one of the outcomes of the war. There was, of course, a massive need to rebuild Europe. There were tremendous problems to sort out with displaced persons from that continue into the 1946, 1947, 1948. I've been looking at some of those reports, and again, the quantities of people are really quite astounding. This is a photograph of testimony at a trial in Nuremberg. The principal architects of military, political, economic of the war in the Third Reich were put on trial. And Nuremberg was an interesting event from a number of standpoints. It was an unprecedented effort to try to bring to justice people on for unprecedented crimes. And they were, there were 4 different crimes that people were charged with and evaluated for in terms of guilt or innocence. One of them being crimes against humanity. Now that's a familiar term today, but it was not at the time of Nuremberg. And one of the criticisms of Nuremberg was that people were being tried for something that didn't exist as a crime at the time, simply because nobody had conceived of it. And perhaps my favorite author of World War II, certainly one of my favorite, is John Keegan. And he says that the weight of history, the judgment of history, has come down on the side of some level of retribution and prosecution for these crimes. But he acknowledges that, he says that as a Western historian. I spoke once years ago with a Hungarian engineer who had served in the armies of the Third Reich. And he once told me, Brooks, he says, you know what Nuremberg was? It was the winners dictating to the losers. And I had to say to this gentleman, I said, yeah, but look at who the losers were. And I think that's and what they did. And that's the opinion that I cling to for all of this. And a number of people were hanged, executed after the war. Some were imprisoned. A few were acquitted of some of the crimes for which they were charged. But a number of them, including Goering, who swallowed poison on the night before his scheduled execution, but Jodl, Keitel, Foreign Minister von Ribbentrop, a range of people were ultimately paid with their lives. Keitel was one of the very few who actually seemed to come around to the fact that, yeah, he really felt guilt for what had happened. He was the ostensible head of Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, which Hitler was really the nominal head, but he had approved, rubber stamped a number of crimes, and that sealed his fate. Next slide, please. This photograph is taken of 10 individuals captured by Third Army near Passau. And the caption is that they were considered to be members of the SS and believed to have participated in the massacre near Malmedy. During the Ardennes campaign, in the early days of it, a group known as Kampfgruppe Piper from the 1st SS Panzer Division captured a small American field artillery observation unit just south, at a crossroads just south of Malmedy, Belgium. And they were lined up in a field. And the commander, Piper, had moved on, and a number of other people. But a few tanks pulled up and opened fire on them. And ultimately, some escaped, but 86 Americans were killed. And this is something that the Americans in particular wanted retribution for. There were also numerous civilian casualties taking place. So after the war, there was intense effort in trying to identify people who were involved in it. And next slide, Mike. In 1946, there was a trial held, I think in Dachau, actually, but it was in one of the camps, of a large number of individuals who were identified as having taken part, either actively or having commanded troops that took part in the massacre. And it went all the way up to the army, the commander of the 6th Panzer Army. The chief of staff is Fritz Kramer, shown standing here, number 33 around his neck. And the commanding officer of the army itself, a man named Sepp Dietrich, who had been formerly Hitler's chauffeur. But on the right-hand side of the photograph, to the left of Kramer, is Joachim Piper, who is somewhat sensational figure for a number of reasons. We won't go into that. But he was tried. Kramer was given a term of imprisonment. Many of them were. But Dietrich and Piper were sentenced to death. The sentences were never carried out for a number of reasons. One of them being that the actual trial itself was called into question by the United States Senate, and one senator in particular, one Joseph McCarthy from Wisconsin, later became famous for another reason. But he had a number of German constituents, German American constituents, who expressed concern about the conduct of the interrogations, which admittedly were somewhat, in some instances, questionable about how confessions were achieved. So ultimately, Piper and Dietrich and others were released, and Piper was attempted to go back to his life in Germany and was very famous among Wehrmacht and SS veterans. But the general public was very hostile to this, and the I think what it reflects is the fact that older Germans had been dying off, and that a younger generation had come along of age. And for example, if you were born in 1946, you were 20 years old in 1966. And they had been re-educated. They had been focused in a different direction. So Piper found the environment in Germany hostile. So he moved to that part of France that was very Germanic, Alsace and Lorraine, and continued to make a living translating books with his wife and his children. And then in 1976, a French communist paper, La Libération, I think it was, published an article in advance of Bastille Day in 1976, and just who this man was who was living in this town. And certain threats were made, and Piper's wife and children moved back to Germany for a time. And then one evening, and again, accounts are somewhat conflicting, but I think it was the night before Bastille Day, or the night of Bastille Day, the home was firebombed, and Piper died in the fire. So ultimately, retribution might have been achieved. If you're interested at all in this period, I'd recommend the film Judgment at Nuremberg because its cast is superb, and it focuses on an interesting aspect of the German culpability, that is the justice system, the judges, and then a somewhat dramatized account. But I think they're using Piper as something of a model for this. Is a film made, it's a Franco and Anglo-French film called Night of the Generals with Peter O'Toole and Omar Sharif. If you can find it, it's an interesting look at this period because they talk about what's happening in Germany in the 60s when the film was made, and the fact that the government's very unhappy at soldiers groups beginning to have reunions and things of that sort. We could go on at great length about this. And there's so many aspects to rebuilding Europe after the war. I would, in the reading list that was sent around with the first talk, and I think Mike can send it again to anybody who'd be interested, Tony Jute's book, Post-War, J-U-D-T, it's a very long, it's an academic study, but it's extremely well written, and it's very approachable. It talks about Europe. It starts with the end of the war, and then talks about Europe's adjustment to that period from a European perspective. Okay, and then the final shot. I thought about, there's a lot of different ways we could bring this all to a close, but there are monuments that, to me, symbolize and seem to encapsulate certain things, and they spring up in Europe every 5 or 10 years, but this one is fairly new. It's behind the sector of Omaha Beach known as Dog Green, where the Rangers and 29th Infantry landed. It would be the sector that's discussed in the movie, the opening scenes of Saving Private Ryan, and it shows a 29th Division soldier assisting another one, but in fact symbolizes all Americans, all British, Canadian, French, Polish, wide range of people that landed on the beaches, that fought in Europe. And stay safe, make smart choices, and continue to tune into these. There's some really good upcoming ones. Joe Galloway and other people will be speaking about more recent military developments. But continue to support the Army Heritage Center Foundation and the Army Heritage Center. It's a special place.